Hey guys, I'm here with Balaji Srinivasan. You guys know him from Twitter. He's the former CTO of Coinbase and the author of The Network State. And Balaji, it's 11 p.m. where you are at halfway around the world. Appreciate you joining us.
Great to be here. So, Lee, I look forward to folks, kind of hearing this at the Texas Blockchain Summit. And I've actually been thinking about what to say, because this is something which is both a kind of political thing, but it's also a technological thing. And you had mentioned that you wanted me to talk about Texas and Florida and so on. You want to give me your question?
Yeah. So there's obviously some differences in the federal system here that's not present in many other countries around the world. And it ties into some of your writing as well. So obviously, the federal government is responsible for quite a bit of digital asset policy, especially as it relates to taxes and securities law. But the states have prerogative over things like banking, money transmission, uniform commercial code, business law. So curious to know your thoughts there on the differences, sort of the pros and cons, and weave in, if you will, some of your thought leadership on the network state front.
Sure. So here's a one-liner: "Make America states again." Okay. Before the Civil War, people used to say the United States are, and then afterwards they say the United States is, like a singular entity. And basically there's this big arc of centralization up from 1789 through 1865 through 1933 with FDR, and that kind of kept going up. And one of the theses in the book is that history is running in reverse, and now we're decentralizing. We're in a decentralizing arc, and the decentralization is coming faster than the centralization was in the first place. And a lot of events are happening in the reverse order. For example, 1991, internet frontier opens. 1890, Western frontier closes. Today we have the tech billionaires. In the past, we had the captains of industry, the robber barons. Today we have COVID-19. Back in the past, we had Spanish flu. And you can actually do dozens and dozens of examples like this. And one that's particularly relevant to this audience is that the entire centralization of power that was going on for essentially 150 years, where FDR in particular essentially invalidated the 10th Amendment and said, everything is interstate commerce and the federal government has total power over everything. That's starting to get unwound. It is, obviously there's sanctuary cities in blue states, but if you start looking at the map of gun laws, drug laws, abortion laws, this law, that law, even immigration policy, you're starting to see a greater and greater divergence between red and blue states. And they're often at variance with what the federal government wants. And that's fine, because states are just not enforcing the federal laws that they don't want to enforce. And actually, that's a huge advantage when the federal government is doing things that are bad or injurious, like not enforcing immigration law, for example. Red states can just take a different path and say, just have a lawsuit, right? And just establish facts on the ground. And I think there's a few areas where that's particularly important. Cryptocurrency is a ridiculously important one of those. Another one is AI, and there's a few other areas that I could talk about. But let me pause there. Does that make sense so far? Should I dive in on why crypto in particular is really important?
Yeah, I would love to hear more of your thoughts. I mean, I think I probably could guess
Obviously, everybody
but
here.
you're gonna kind of elucidate on some of those a little bit deeper. So that'd be great.
Yeah. So there's a post that I put up. Maybe we can put it on screen. It's called "Did Republicans Pay for 2008?" Okay. Maybe you can find this tweet while we're talking. Just look for Balaji. Did Republicans pay for 2008? And it's essentially a really important graph that explains something, which is, how do Republicans go from the suit and tie wearing Republicans of the Bush era, like 20 years ago, to like the trucker hat wearers of the Trump era? How did that happen? And one answer comes from this amazing graph, which I don't think people have fully, seen the importance of, which essentially shows that in 2008, if you take Democrat counties and Republican counties, they were roughly equally matched in GDP. And then by 2018, the Democrat counties have pulled way away, basically like plus $20,000 GDP per capita on average. And the Republican counties had even regressed, and all of the richest counties were Democrat. Okay. Now, what else happened from 2008 to 2016? Well, you had an administration that was spending all of this printed money. Okay. And
viewers can see it now. We've pulled it up on the screen. I don't know if you can see it.
Exactly. Right. So this is the graph. Can you click that graph and just zoom in a little bit? This graph is so important. It comes from a Wall Street Journal article. You can go and look at it. Fundamentally, if you see the thing, it says 2008 distribution. It's the solid line outline. If you look at that solid line, back in 2008, the blue and the red had roughly equal prosperity. Blue counties and red counties had roughly equal GDPs. But by 2018, as you can see, the blue distribution is pulled way up, and its median is way above the red distribution. So somehow, over 10 years, Democrat counties just became really rich and Republican counties became poor. And one explanation for that is basically the Cantillon effect, where if you're close to the stream of printed money, you get a greater share of the purchasing power. And so in my view, what happened, though, we have to actually get into the detail. Like, one of the things is these flows of funds are opaque. It's not on a blockchain. We can't track them, and so on and so forth. But if we look at where the stimulus and bailout dollars went, they went disproportionately to blue banks and blue people and blue institutions in blue counties. And by the time that effectively counterfeit dollar bill makes its way to somebody in Oklahoma or Texas or something like that, it's been diluted down a lot. It's been spent multiple times. The purchasing power has gone out of it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? So people know the negative effect of inflation, and they know the Cantillon effect, but I don't think people have put it together to say, oh, it just so happened that over this administration, the opposite, the political opponents may have gotten stuck with the bag of the dilution that accompanies inflation, because that's what inflation is. It's dilution. When they printed all this money, it didn't make the country richer. It didn't make anybody richer. It just said, we're going to dilute everybody down and reallocate a bunch of capital. It's like if there's $1 trillion that people hold and you print another trillion, all holders just got diluted down 50%, then you reallocate the cap table, right? Okay. Yeah. So once you see this, you're like, oh, okay, that explains a lot about the last 10, 15, 20 years, which is why Republicans suddenly just lose everywhere, because the entire deck is stacked against them. All of this printed money has essentially diluted them down and diluted their opponents up. And it's amazing they're even in the game. And it's incredible with the entire deck rigged against you like this, right? Mm-hmm. And so so the thing is that Bitcoin actually may, there may be a rematch of this exact thing, because we're on the precipice. Morgan Stanley, a bunch of others have written about this. There's a zillion. We're on the precipice of financial crisis 2.0, except this time sovereign debt crisis. Ray Dalio has written about this. If you guys have seen this, you can look at his
latest book on it. I read a few months ago. The rise, or what was it called?
Principles of the Changing World Order.
Yeah, Principles of the Changing World Order. It's a great one.
It's a great book, worth watching. There's a 40-minute version of it on YouTube that's free. It's 40 million views, so worth watching. Stanley Druckenmiller is good. There's this real estate guy, Barry Sternlicht. He's very good. Luke Groman, Lynn Alden has written about this, Broken Money. Lawrence Leopard on Twitter. There's Peter St. Onge, Kathleen Tyson. These are just some names you can all look up. But if you put it together, essentially you have a bunch of simultaneous crises that are hitting. If you look at the performance of Bitcoin versus bonds, basically you have a bond crisis, you have a banking crisis, you have a commercial real estate crisis, you have a credit card crisis, you have a student loan crisis, you have a lot of crises all piling up at the same time. What does that exactly look like? God only knows exactly how it all comes together. But I do think that there's definitely a non-trivial possibility of a lot of printing to come. And there's other possibilities as well. There could be seizures. There could be it could be die by fire, die by ice. There's other routes. But fundamentally, I think one of the bills that Texas passed, which said the right to hold Bitcoin shall not be infringed. Pretty glad you guys passed that. Pretty important that a bunch of states pass something like that. Because that's what's going to be important. It is, can I give an analogy, Lee?
Sure.
Okay. So in 2011, you remember the Arab Spring?
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
I was actually in the military, in Army officer candidacy school when the Arab Spring started. I was in Fort Benning, Georgia, watching it on the screen, thinking, you know what, this is this is not good.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. It was called an Arab Spring, but it was really more like an Arab, it was chaos, basically, right?
yeah, it's very nuanced. Like different countries had different, like
Yes,
democracy was trying to push through, but then also it was,
violent,
chaotic,
and yes,
violent.
a lot of crazy things happening. Some things arguably good, but a lot of just crazy stuff. The reason I mention it is around that time, the Facebook movie came out. It came out in 2010. Okay. And if you go back and you watch that movie, The Social Network, there's not a single mention of politics in the movie.
Hmm.
It's something where there's a whole movie made about, this. It's clearly important enough to get a movie made about it. They talk about the sheer scale of the user base. They talk about how much money was made, but it's all portrayed as like poking and liking. Yet at that time, 2010, 2011, 2012, it was clear that social media could destabilize governments, that it could overturn, governments in the Middle East. And so you had this weird thing where on the one hand, this thing was being called a fad and a bubble, and it was important enough to, make movies about, but not really taken that seriously. And yet on the other hand, it's clearly overturning governments on another part of the world, right? And so if you had said in 2011 that in 10 years, the single most important political issue in the world, at least for a few days, will be whether the president of the United States of America can tweet. Okay. And moreover, that all politics would become social media in the 2010s, even given how big social media was at that time, even given that we had seen the Arab Spring and all of this instability that happened, even given that the thing was at 500 million people and clearly an important thing, even given all that, that would have seemed like a huge leap, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so I want you to kind of take that kind of extrapolation now, move with me forward 10 years. Okay. 2021 or 2022, 2023, where's cryptocurrency? So it's clearly big enough that it's at like $1 trillion market cap. And it's this massive space with every government and bank in the world, not just heard about it once, but is aware of it, is regulating it, or it's doing stablecoin projects, or it's arguing about an ETF and so on and so forth. It's not like they've heard of Bitcoin for the first time. They've heard of Bitcoin 1,000 times, right? Every government in the bank in the world has heard of it. Every financial institution, every investor has heard about it. They have a position on it one way or the other. And moreover, we have countries like El Salvador, but also like Bhutan and Panama and the Central African Republic have flirted with it. You have states like Wyoming. You have states like Tennessee with their DAO laws. You have countries doing stablecoin projects. You have, in El Salvador's case, a sovereign country that's actually adopted Bitcoin as a national currency. So we know first it's of, huge worldwide importance with hundreds of millions of people. Second, that it's affected small governments outside the US, right? But still, if I was to say that in the 2020s, all politics becomes crypto tribalism, and by the early 2030s, the most important issue in the world will be whether a country has enough Bitcoin. It's not solvent if it doesn't have enough Bitcoin. That would still seem like a stretch.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that's where we're going. And the reason I think so is, to extend the analogy, in the 2010s, the mainstream media, after calling social media a fad and a bubble, it switched to a new narrative, which was threat to democracy. Remember that? Right.
Yeah.
And actually, social media is ultra democracy. Everybody is voting all the time. They have speech. It's even open borders. Everybody around the world can participate. So it's like ultra democracy. But what they didn't like is all these new voices, could get online. And the mainstream media did not like having to fight for its share of voice. And so this brutal counter revolution went on in the late 2010s. I say brutal in the sense of mainstream media was canceling lots of people, really pushing thought and speech control. And all that seemed like it was going to work until Elon basically acquired Twitter and turned the whole thing around. But essentially, mainstream media did not like just becoming another poster on the internet, right?
Sure.
And so in the same way, mainstream money in the 2020s is not going to like becoming just another crypto asset. Okay. That's a good analogy where it's just another asset, like a stable coin like asset in your portfolio. It's going to fight for its pride of place, and it's going to try to attack, especially anything that's really rising against it, such as Bitcoin. And there's this amazing graphic. So if you want to pull up another tweet, can you pull up one where I said Bitcoin milkshake?
Okay.
That's a fun little graphic.
While I'm pulling this up here, one thing I will say is when we talk to elected officials, we do have to talk about short-term and long-term, right? So short-term, I think this fits with your thesis that Bitcoin and stable coins can prolong the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And so that's really what...
Well, so what I think would be awesome is if Texas or Florida issues a Texas dollar, a Florida dollar, that's under the control of the governor, that is one-for-one exchangeable as of right now with the US dollar, but it's backed by Bitcoin. And the reason you do that is so that Texas and Florida can't get deplatformed like the truckers or the Russians. And they have their own state banking system, just like DeSantis has the Florida militia, the Florida State Guard.
Yeah.
Right. And he's recruiting for that. He's got $100 million budget for it. He's really serious about it. They've got their own now Florida colleges and stuff like that. If you go back, that was the image actually. If you can reload that. Oops, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can edit this out, obviously.
We will pull this out of there. There we go. Can you see it now?
Yeah, exactly. So click that. Global currencies 10-year returns versus a dollar. So essentially, over the last 10 years, virtually every other fiat currency has collapsed against the dollar, or it collapsed or fell against the dollar, okay? Because the dollar is sort of the center of the fiat economy. So even though they print a lot, it's basically like a tax on the entire world. That's the thing. Yes, Americans are taxed to pay for like wars and stuff abroad, but actually the world is also taxed silently because diluted down in various ways. Lots of debt is dollar denominated and so on. So all these currencies are depreciated against the dollar, but Bitcoin is massively appreciated against the dollar by 20,000%. You see that?
Yep.
So this is actually a really important, this has now been going on for better part of a decade, right? The smart money has been either exiting other fiat to the dollar or exiting the dollar for Bitcoin. And so if you extrapolate that out, and of course, extrapolations are fraught, but still, this is a 10-year trend involving hundreds of millions of people. It's a global trend. So it's got like a lot of energy behind it, in my view. And this is before the recent price increases and so on of BTC. That suggests that, look, people in Texas understand the Second Amendment. The federal government may not always be on your side, right? This is kind of like that. Getting Bitcoin at the state level and getting Bitcoin at the individual level is something where it's like, okay, you've got a backup plan, right? You've got the digital equivalent of the Second Amendment in a sense, right? Where it is not self-defense, but self-sovereign currency. And this is something that's enough of the crucial thing is you have allies on this because there's way more Bitcoiners than there are Republicans or Democrats or even Americans. There's hundreds of millions worldwide, right? So that gets you tapped into a network of people who share values worldwide. And so this way you can have your dollar, but back it too. Eat your cake and have it too. Have your dollar, but back it too. So and the way
let me dive in on that and ask you a question there, though. What percentage would you say? Because a lot of people, especially in the developing world, are using Bitcoin just because it works, and they have no idea about. They probably never heard of decentralization or censorship-resistant money. They just use it as those things, whether they live in an authoritarian government or a democracy. They're just using it because it's better than holding their dollars in the Sudanese pound or the Syrian pound or the bolivar or whatever.
Sure.
And they're using it for commerce. Now in the US, we don't use it for commerce because of our lack of tax de minimis exemptions on the tax front for payments. But do you think that most Bitcoiners are, I guess I'll say, in my opinion, most Bitcoiners are probably there for the practicality of it on a global scale. Now, in the US and in the Western world, very much a values thing, but in the developing world, I think it's probably more practicality.
True. Yes. So when I say share values, you're right that people may be using it pragmatically, but they share the value in the sense of they want to be able to hold their currency. They don't fully trust the state. There's an implicit and explicit way of kind of expressing those things, though I agree with you. I would say something else, which is often what they'll do. And, one of my friends, Alexander Leishman, was tweeting about this. He said, and this is true, that the emerging stack is hold Bitcoin for long-term savings, then use USD or USDC or USDT like for short-term spending.
Yeah.
Right. So that's actually a practical solution where you can have, because stablecoins can accommodate arbitrarily high scale of payments nowadays, in dollar numbers and so on. So you hold Bitcoin as your long-term savings account in a sense, or at least part of it. And then you have some percentage in essentially fiat or on-chain fiat. So the reason I was saying that, something that Texas could do, something that Florida could do, all these regional banks right now are under serious pressure, and they are not being given a too big to fail backstop by the Fed. Okay. And one way of thinking about it is just like we know that obviously politicians, there's red and blue politicians. We know that the media outlets is red and blue. We know that Supreme Court justices is red and blue. That's also true for banks. Everything in the US can be coded as red and blue or like gray for like tech guys. And what's happened with the banks is essentially the tech banks, those got essentially sold bonds that, got blown up, so SVB and FRC. Lots of the red banks, the regional banks, got sold bonds that are also blowing up, or real estate portfolios that are getting crushed by these interest rates. Yeah. But the big blue banks, which are JPMC and Citibank, and to a lesser extent, Bank of America and Wells Fargo, those have a too big to fail backstop from the federal government. So all these regional banks are essentially playing a rigged game where they don't have that too big to fail backstop, and they're getting either acquired by the big banks and or shut down in messy ways. And so that's bad because it essentially means that you have a slow motion that might speed up consolidation of the banking system into like just 4 banks. And then it's very easy to monitor all your transactions, to CBDC you, to surveil you, all that kind of stuff. Right? With me so far?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So if you're at the state level and you want to stop this, prevent this, reverse this, you need something that's not simply, it is important to ban CBDC or to push against that, or things that look, often what they'll do is they'll just change some of the words. So, like FedNow, yeah, it's not technically a CBDC, but it is central bank digital control. Okay. So they'll change some of the words, but they'll say it's not a CBDC. And then you're like, oh, okay, well, no problem then. No, actually it still routes every payment through the Fed. Okay. So rather than just being against something though, you want to be for something. So what would you be for? One thought is if history is running in reverse, if, you're having this decentralization arc, if now the SEC is losing battles, why not at the state level go and put new blood into the state banking charters, and actually as a governor or, legislature or both, depending on, what red state it is, you say all these state banks must bank crypto companies. Okay. Now, what does that do? First is all these deposits that were uncertain, because crypto banking is still a problem in other places. All these uncertain deposits come home to regional red banks.
Yeah.
Exactly. Number one. Okay. So that takes the tech guys who have just been unbanked by the blues, and it takes the Republicans and the Reds whose banks are being destroyed by the blues, and it puts them together, right? Because the Reds have some political power and they have some control over state banking. And the grays, the tech guys, have actually quite a lot of money, but they don't have stability because their banks are getting blown up or they're getting, pushed out of banking by the blues. And you put that together, that's actually an interesting alliance, right? tech money, tech crypto money flowing into regional red banks. And then the question is, will the Fed actually yank the ability, and each of these, like the state banking systems are a little different at state to state level, but will the Fed yank or inhibit the ability of those state chartered banks to wire money in and out? I don't think they would actually, I think they would not go so far as to unbank Florida or Texas as a whole. I think they'd blink first.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and that's actually
of the economy.
Exactly. It's too much friendly fire. They'd be hitting too many. It would basically blow their cover, where the financial repression that they want to implement would now be something that they have to like take down an entire state to do. They have to unbank all these banks in the state. So you take that latent capacity, just like what DeSantis has done with the Florida State Guard. He took that latent thing and he made it real. You take the latent state power and you make it real, and you just suddenly bring in huge amounts of new money into these state chartered banks, and you save essentially some form of local control over your banking system, and it doesn't go all the way to the federal government. And you have all this crypto DNA and IQ and talent and money coming locally. And that's actually a really good combination, right? Now, moreover, going a little bit further, what you could do is you just have a very simple, like, as formerly CTO of Coinbase. So if you go all the way back to Coinbase 2013, all it let you do was buy, sell, send, and receive Bitcoin. Okay. That's now something which a lot of people can implement that. Okay. That's like a commodity almost, to just set up a very simple exchange. So imagine you set up bitcoin.texas.gov. Okay. Bitcoin.florida.gov. And what is this? It's a very simple, it's the, the gold window. You remember the gold window?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Right. States used to have a gold window where you could just go and give some dollars and get back a bar of gold, or a little, bit of gold. So now you reopen the digital gold window, okay, at bitcoin.texas.gov, and anybody can go from a state chartered bank and deposit some money there, some dollars, and get some Bitcoin. And you're charged a fee of like $10 a day or whatever it is to hold. The state wants you to take your Bitcoin off that server as fast as possible and bring it locally, right? So it encourages self-custody. Okay. Moreover, the state takes a fee of, I don't know what, let's say some fractional percent. I don't know the exact amount. So every single time somebody does this and converts $1,000 into, Bitcoin, the state itself accumulates a little bit of Bitcoin. This is how you build up Texas's Bitcoin reserve.
Yeah.
And this is how you build up Florida's Bitcoin reserve, and so on. Moreover, these order books, because you've got Texas's liquidity, Florida's liquidity, it's a little bit more sophisticated, but all the buy and sell orders and stuff, you can have all the red states mirror the order books and liquidity. So Texas can peer with Florida, and they can peer with Coinbase or Kraken or Gemini, right? So essentially, the companies can help you bootstrap the liquidity here until eventually the states are kind of like running on their own accord, right? And in this way, Texas, Florida, Wyoming, all of the states, including purple states, maybe like Colorado, you could, might want to join this. And maybe there'd be places that surprise you, like, Eric Adams is a Bitcoin guy and he's in New York, right? Maybe there's cities that might surprise you. Okay. Any jurisdiction could set up its own government digital gold window to buy, sell, send, and receive Bitcoin, and accumulate a Bitcoin reserve as a function of this, and accumulate the know-how to store Bitcoin, basically all that kind of stuff. You want to work out those muscles now, before the sovereign debt crisis. I shouldn't say before there is one. We're in the middle of one. Let's say before it fully hits, right? Before it's fully recognized. There's not, maybe God knows how long we have on that. Maybe it's like years, maybe it's months. It's really hard to time this kind of stuff. With the 2008 crisis, Bernanke was saying it was going to be a mild recession in April 2008, 6 months before the thing blew up, right? So what I'm describing there is actually not that hard to get set up, right?
Yeah.
It's well within the capabilities
of
many
people hard,
watching
not technically hard.
Maybe, but actually, there's a lot of smart. I mean, there's smart states in the audience, I'm sure. Smart people in Texas. If you could get the bill that says, Bitcoin shall not be infringed, right? If you can get an anti-CBDC bill through in Florida, I think it's totally possible to get this new revenue stream through especially something that, I mean, look, you guys are the experts. Okay. I'll leave it to you on that part. Right. But if you can make it feasible politically, absolutely, we can bring in engineers and help you make it feasible technologically. So,
Yeah.
and
Well,
and
we
then you
are in
bring
the
banking locally. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the chairman of the Texas Department of Banking, Charles Cooper, is highly respected across all 50 states. He, he had the state's seat on FSOC. He is, well, anyways, highly respected. We have met with the Texas Bullion Depository, which is where Texans and others can, and even the state of Texas can store gold physically here in Texas. It's outside of Austin,
Perfect.
Texas. And we asked them about potentially having cold storage for Bitcoin there. So the conversations have been very early and they're not quite there yet, but I think what you're describing really builds that thesis out further.
Yeah. I mean, I think what it does also is it relates to essentially the federal attack on the regional banking system, right? What happened was the federal government sold bonds that they said that they weren't going to devalue, and then they mass devalued them, destroying basically every bank that was dumb enough, unfortunate enough,
They have
forced
huge bond holdings,
to.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, lots of these banks, as dumb is not really the right word, because many of them are sort of forced to by regulations. Basel III, for example, requires you to buy so-called high-quality liquid assets. You know, the analogy I give to people is like, imagine if, I wrote this article, you can Google it, Bond villain, okay? Powell's a Bond villain, right? Like Bond villain, like James Bond, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
So the reason I say that is, as an analogy, imagine if Apple, they said to Walmart and to Best Buy and to Target, they said, we have the iPhone 10 and we're not going to make a new iPhone for a long time. So buy $1 billion here, $1 billion there, $1 billion. They sold billions of dollars of iPhone 10s to Walmart, Target, Best Buy, all these guys. Okay. Then after they sold a bunch of this inventory, sales final, they say, way to beat, iPhone 11. Okay. And they just massively just depreciate all those guys, the Walmarts, the Targets, the Best Buys, they're like, oh my God, because suddenly their inventory just got depreciated 20, 30%, not all the way to zero, but why would you want an iPhone 10 when there's a shiny new iPhone 11, the thing Apple said that it wasn't going to do, right? That is a very good analogy for the Fed selling billions and billions of dollars, really it's Fed and Treasury, I should say, the state selling billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of bonds at 1% rates, saying that they were never going to change those rates. And then bang, like a year and a half later, rates are at like 5%. Why would you want 1%, bonds at 1% when you can get them at 5%? Of course, you'll get the 5% bonds if they're at the same price. So all the old ones get devalued. And so bonds have gotten absolutely destroyed over the last few years. Yeah. And yet people are obligated to buy them. So you have this weird, if you look at TLT in particular, someone posted this graph, I'm not sure if I can find it, but like all these lemmings running to, maybe mandated to buy these bonds, even as the price is just crashing down like this, right? So what that did is, because bonds aren't supposed to be trading like tech stocks, bonds are supposed to be the risk-free, what are treasuries? Like, this is supposed to be the risk-free rate of return, right? The most liquid asset in the world. Instead, it's definitely not a risk-free rate of return. You're taking massive risk when you're holding these things. They're destroying positions, A. And B, they're not the most liquid asset because you have to, quote, hold them to maturity so that they, at least show up on your books as being worth what you paid for them, not what you could sell them for. I know it's a little bit technical. Maybe people in the audience get what I'm saying. Point being, the Fed sold all of these regional banks, all these other banks, a bag of goods. They sold them an asset. They devalued it. And now those regional banks are in big trouble. And so they need a Hail Mary. They need something big so that they don't go under and get all essentially scooped up, centralized, et cetera, by, JPMC gets effectively printed money from the government. So then JPMC does the purchase or whatever, but it's actually still a backdoor, essentially government acquisition or bailout. So that I think I don't know if it accelerates it, at least as I lay out the reasoning there, it seems to me that should increase the urgency of maybe doing something. But again, you guys are the local politics experts. I will totally defer to you.
I think it's a fascinating concept. And I know we have several Texas elected officials in the audience, and some who are actually in a special session in Austin right now who can't make it. who I will be sending this to,
Great.
and they are going to be fascinated with it. A lot of them are, Texas elected officials are part-time, in office, right? So they're full-time doctors, lawyers, bankers, financial professionals, et cetera. And then they're part-time legislators. And many of them work in private equity and finance. And
So they
so
get it.
they get it. And I've got a couple in mind that I'm just going to make sure that they get this. And I think, it will really spark a good conversation with them. Okay, as we wrap up
Awesome.
here,
Great.
I'm cognizant of your time, and I know it's probably almost
Sure.
midnight there. Give the audience just one more kind of thought on, as this expands globally, where have you seen, and kind of in your writing in the network state, of course, there's some city states that have been very, Singapore and others in Europe that have been very active. I'm thinking like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, but where are there other jurisdictions? And I guess part of the concept is there really doesn't need to be large jurisdictions because there's competition between jurisdictions on this. But what are you most excited about on the policy and regulatory front globally?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in the short version is, if you are the person who's out of power, if you're the individual, right? If you're the American conservative or you're the Chinese liberal, right? If you are the person in a developing country who just wants a bank account, or if you're the power user who wants to push the limits of what a bank account even is, that's a crypto coalition. So it's essentially, roughly speaking, it's everybody who's not extremely satisfied with DC or Beijing.
Gotcha.
Okay. Which is actually it's a good way of framing it.
Counter-statism, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So those two capitals centralize a lot of power, right? DC indirectly essentially controls not just, the Fed, but it's also Bank of Canada, Bank of Japan, lots of banks in Europe. They've got these central banking meetings. They all hike and cut often, if not at the same time. They're highly influenced. It's a whole, they even talk about a central banking mafia or what have you, right? And then Beijing, of course, is its own thing, and they're very highly centralized. And so then everybody else who's not essentially, who doesn't want to be under the thumb of DC or Beijing, that could be red states, American conservatives within the US. It's also like Chinese liberals. There's a lot of people within China who, like Jack Ma, and a lot of entrepreneurs there are chafing, and they're being told to shut up, and often they are, but like they don't like it too much. And crypto gives them some semblance of freedom, so they're not having every transaction tracked in their entire lives, or at least they have some option of opting out of the system. And then, so that's one dynamic to it, sort of like the minority dissident, dynamic, the American conservatives and Chinese liberals. Another dynamic is at the global level, small countries of two different kinds. So there's your Singapores and Dubais and your financial centers, like even like Mauritius, places like that, Monaco. And then there's also your countries, which are interesting, like El Salvador or Palau, Bhutan, right? These have embraced cryptocurrency, just put themselves on the map because there's like almost 200 UN member countries. And these countries just got, leaders that understood, the reason I name El Salvador, Bhutan, Palau, their heads of state are crypto guys. And they understand that this is like a part of the way to see the world that people aren't thinking about. It's not the big two of DC and Beijing fighting each other. It's all the other countries that people are ignoring that are still sovereigns, right? And so there's a lot of alpha or arbitrage or opportunity there in kind of what people aren't seeing. It's not just the big two capitals fighting each other, it's everybody else. And I think ultimately everybody else is a larger coalition than those who are just loyal to DC or Beijing, or just under their thumb rather. Or at least I think we've got a shot at that. And that's why one of the things in the Network State book is that the tech sectors of the world get broken up into NYT, CCP, BTC, right? So is it controlled by Washington, DC and the New York Times? Is it controlled by the Chinese Communist Party? Or is it in the free sphere, Bitcoin sphere? And I hope to expand that sphere.
Wow, what a great way to wrap up the conversation. Mr. Srinivasan, thank you for taking some time to be with us. And we look forward to following your work and your thought leadership in the months and years to come.
Awesome. Thank you.